we're now moving to two really exciting sessions on disruptive changes for society and on leadership. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to Karen Middleton. Karen will be a familiar face to many of you from being on SBS as a journalist and also other media for many years. She was the chief political correspondent for SBS TV, and she's now freelancing and working on her second book. Her first book, for those of you that have worked in the humanitarian sector and in Afghanistan in particular, you all know, was An Unwinnable War, Australia and Afghanistan, published by Melbourne University Press in 2011, and it charts the political backstory to Australia's military commitment from the terrorist attacks in 9/11 and through a decade of war in that country that Australia was deeply involved in. Karen worked with the ADF and reported from Afghanistan on and off for many, many years. What's your second book about, Karen?
It's a political biography of persons unnamed.
We're going to look forward to that one. So without further ado, please welcome Karen to the stage.
I'm not sure how long I'm going to get away with that, but I'm still doing it. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for having me here today. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's a rare joy, may I say, on a parliamentary sitting day in Canberra to turn around and leave town. I'm still not used to doing that. It's my pleasure to be here for a couple of sessions this afternoon and again this evening. The first one we have this afternoon is entitled Disruptive Challenges for Society, and we have four esteemed panellists up here who are going to join with us in a conversation about the disruptive challenges and hopefully the disruptive solutions. So we would like to take a very practical approach to this, not just wring our hands and say, oh, everything's terrible, but what do we need to do to address the change that is coming, and how do we have to change ourselves to address it? So I'll just run through how we anticipate this session going. We'll hear from each of our four speakers initially, so I will introduce them one at a time, and they'll talk for about 5 minutes, exactly 5 minutes, they all tell me, which is excellent. And then we'll start a bit of a discussion up here, but I'm encouraging you to ask questions. So if you have a burning question on whatever it is we're talking about at the time, please raise your hand. There are two roving mics like you've had earlier in the day, and we'll hear the question and we'll let things flow from there, and we'll have a burst of questions from the floor at the end. So if you feel like you haven't had a chance, you'll get your chance in the last 5 minutes. We're due to wind up about 4:20, I think. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who tells me he is the heretic in our midst. It's a good way to start. Dr. Hayden Washington has a 40-year history in environmental science. He has many degrees. He has a degree in ecology, a Masters of Science in Ecotechnology, Heavy Metal Pollution, a DipEd and a PhD. Hayden has worked as an investigations scientist in CSIRO studying heavy metal pollution and acid mine drainage. And he's also worked as director of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales and for many years as an environmental consultant. He's conducted many flora surveys as a plant ecologist. He's also worked extensively within environmental non-government organisations, including being a councillor on the Australian Conservation Foundation Council for 4 terms. He's an environmental writer and the author of many articles and 6 books on the environment. I bow down to you, Hayden. And here's one he prepared earlier. So Hayden is visiting fellow at the Institute of Environmental Studies in University of New South Wales, and a sessional lecturer at University of New South Wales, and currently on the executive board of the Colong Foundation for Wilderness and co-director of the New South Wales chapter of the Centre for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy, which sounds like a very fine thing. Please welcome Dr. Hayden Washington.
Made me realise I should have handed in the short resume. So yes, I'll be your friendly heretic today because I'd like to actually question some given truths that we tend to have in society. Because what I'm arguing in my book, Demystifying Sustainability, is that it's time to get real about sustainability. It's 28 years since Our Common Future came out, the so-called Brundtland Report, and we're more unsustainable now than we were when it came out then. How do we know? Well, there's lots of indicators around. I'm an environmental scientist, so we've got a global ecological footprint. Well, we've been saying 1.5 planets for a few years. It's more like 1.7 planets if you look at the graph. The Living Planet Index has dropped 52%, more than half since 1970. The extinction rate is 1,000 to 10,000, we're not sure, times higher than the natural level. And that means the latest estimate is if we keep going on the way we are now, by the end of this century, 2/3 of life will be extinct on Earth. As Aileen Christ of Virginia Tech observes, the scale of what we're doing, the sheer moral evil, is almost unimaginable. Now, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. We're really wise. But we could actually be called Homo denialensis because we're very good at denying things we don't want to believe in or denying reality. And key amongst that is the endless growth myth. Now, I've taught primary school kids, and you can talk to them about, ask them about, do you think on a finite planet is endless growth, physical growth possible? And they sort of go, oh, duh, no. And I ask all my audiences that, and I've never actually had someone put their hand up to say, yeah, yes it is. And yet the endless growth myth is actually the mantra of governments and many NGOs around the world. And in fact, it's the biggest elephant in the room that, can you all see it over there, crowding out the rest of it? The trouble is, and it has baby elephants. One of them is overpopulation, rarely talked about in many venues. The other one's overconsumption, also rarely talked about. For instance, there have been many estimates of what an ecologically sustainable population for the world might be. They range between 2 and 5 billion. As you know, we're above 7.3. And the question of overconsumption is rarely talked about, even though peak oil is really here and peak phosphorus is coming soon with many other things. Now, the goal for many today is still that the less developed countries should join the more developed countries like Australia in their consumption habits. And yet you'd need another 4 planets if you were going to do that sustainably. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. So endless growth now is actually the cause, or endless physical growth, we can keep growing our morals and our ethics forever, is actually the cause of unsustainability. And yet it's still seen as a saviour. Now, some of you may remember Norman Lindsay's The Magic Pudding, about a pudding that could never be consumed. It kept coming back, but it's a nice children's story, but it's not a really good blueprint for a sustainable society. It's actually irrational and fundamentally unsustainable. So sustainable development's been bandied around endlessly and discussed and buried under many layers of jargon. But when you go back to it, the UN's brief to the World Commission on Environment Development, 1987, was growth-based. The World Commission on Environment Development report was based on a 5% GDP growth rate. UNEP's Green Economy that came out in 2011 was a new engine of growth. And of course we have green growth from OECD. So sustainable development is really taken by many people to mean sustainable growth. And on a finite planet, when you've passed ecological limits where things are breaking down, that is actually an oxymoron. So people like ecological economist Herman Daly define development as being qualitative change, not quantitative change. However, that's not the main meaning in society. What do we mean by a developer in society? It's not a great artist or a great composer. It's someone who knocks things down and puts up buildings. So I don't believe that sustainability is actually the same as what sustainable development has come to mean. Now, so if sustainability is going to be meaningful, then I think it can't be sustainababble. It can't mean all things to all people. It can't be a denial of reality. It has to be about realism. And that means we need to accept the problems we have and solve them. It can't mean we ignore ecological limits of the Earth, not when you're looking at 2/3 of life going extinct. That's a bit of a giveaway that we may have exceeded limits. Therefore, it can't be about endless physical growth on a finite planet. So any supposedly sustainable project that is based on continuing physical growth is really a delusion. So if we mean growth by development, and let's face it, most people in government do, then sustainability isn't really the same as sustainable development to my mind. Because, also, it's very common that there's a lot of talk about a thing called weak sustainability by economists, which is the idea that we can substitute money and human capital, built capital, for ecosystem services. And this really breaks ecological reality. That's why ecosystems are in decline. So at a minimum, sustainability has got to be about strong sustainability that maintains the ecosystem services that support our society, on which our society depends. The other thing is sustainability can't be ethics-free. It can't be based on an anthropocentric human supremacy approach where humanity has always got to be the master. That's how we got into the problems we're in today with an environmental crisis. Now, solutions do exist. As I say, I'm a realist. I think we have to look at the grim situation, but there are positive solutions. I list 9 of them in my book. I'm not going to go through them now because of time, but key amongst them is denial. If we can actually break the denial dam, if we can accept the reality of our predicament, then humanity can use what's being called co-intelligence, our ability to solve problems, and its creativity to actually reach a meaningful sustainability. So I'm not here to say it's too late. To my mind, it's never too late. It is time, though, to accept we have problems and to move to what Thomas Berry, the great theologian, called the great work, which is really repairing the earth and also making it a more equitable place. So we cannot really continue to mean endless physical growth if we talk about development. Development, I think it's time for ACFID. I would suggest it is one of the great challenges that ACFID faces to realise that endless physical growth is not the solution to the future. It's actually the cause of many of our problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayden. Second now we have, and I think the other speakers are going to remain seated here, but second on our list today is Archie Law. Archie's here to my left, your right. He is the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia, familiar to many of you, which is an affiliate, as you know, of ActionAid International. Before joining ActionAid, Archie worked for the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York, as well as for the United Nations Development Programme in South Africa, working on conflict prevention, aid and recovery across Africa. He spent 4 years heading up the Mine Advisory Group in Cambodia, working on its extensive landmine removal program. And in the late 90s, Archie worked for World Vision Australia, where he managed several emergency relief projects. He was the drummer for the Australian rock band the Huxton Creepers in the 1980s. You knew he looked familiar, right? We aim to give you a whole picture of everyone here. And if you want his academic credentials, Archie has a Bachelor of Arts Honours and a Master of Arts in International Relations from Monash University. Please welcome Archie Law.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. Yeah, I didn't actually do those degrees while I was playing drums, but before I get going, I remember being in the UN Secretariat and an ambassador was coming past our section with the director of the part of DPKO I worked in. And he introduced me and said, and this is Archie, he's working on Iraq. He has quite an eclectic background. I thought, yeah, that sounds familiar. Terrific to be with everyone today on such an auspicious occasion, 50 years of ACFID. It's something really to celebrate and it also gives us renewed focus on the future. A future building really on Hayden's presentation that in some ways could be looked at as quite dark. But in other ways, there is so much light and opportunity ahead of us. Because really, I think one of the main predominant views is out there now is we're looking at an absolute complex system meltdown. So in a sense, we have a war between the global economy and Mother Earth, which is leading to the biggest crisis that the world's seen, largely caused by whatever form of capitalism is out there now, which is really some sort of out-of-control, careering, crony-based model which sings to the song of deregulation, privatisation, low taxes, small state, all of this stuff we're growing up on for those of us who are somewhere around the 70s. And it leads us to an interesting place. Well, I was with Kumi Naidu from Greenpeace earlier this year, who tells some fantastic stories. I think he's got about 4 or 5 anecdotes at a time, Kumi, that he just rolls out, and they're wonderful. But I thought I'd just share a couple. He was saying that this isn't actually about the future of Mother Earth. The Earth will be fine. We'll all die, and the Earth will renew itself. So we don't have a problem there. But it's also this view of this complex system meltdown is shared by many people, many influential thinkers, from the Naomi Kleins of the world to the Pope. We're not dealing with any sort of radical thinking here. One more Kumi story. Kumi also said that he was talking to Al Gore, and Al Gore was talking about the encyclical about Laudato Si. I mean, anyone who hasn't read that should read that. That is a beautiful piece of writing that really strikes at the heart and something totally inspiring. But Al Gore said, in my country, which is the same as our country, there's quite a popular phrase of, is the Pope a Catholic? And he said, who would ever have thought that would end up being a question? So really what we need is a new economic system, one that works for people, one that works for the earth. And that is probably the biggest wake-up call that civilisations had, because the laws of nature are not going to change. So it's us that need to change. And then when the world and the world leaders, I think increasingly we're getting there, accept that this is the biggest existential threat that we've ever faced, then we accept that we have to plan and manage our societies, including the economy. Then we accept that the market has failed to actually provide human beings with what they require to live on this planet. So in order to save humanity, which is really what we're dealing with, there's a need to shift gears. We need to shift quickly. We need to leap. And those gears are already shifting. I mean, one of my favourite writers is Arundhati Roy, and one of the pieces I love that Arundhati writes about is saying that a new world is coming. On a quiet day, if you listen very carefully, you can hear her breathe. And I would argue that breathing is getting increasingly loud and getting increasingly impossible to ignore, because the gears are shifting. You look at 400,000 people who turn up at the New York Climate March, plus. I'm being conservative. You look at 250,000 people turning up in Berlin saying no to the transatlantic trade agreement. You look at the 1,000 brave medical staff down at the Royal Children's Hospital who are actually going to dismantle detention for asylum seekers. Courageous people who are taking this issue on a humanitarian basis. And I would argue we are starting to win. We look at, in Australia, we look at what's happened in the Galilee Basin, what's happened there. We look at the victory in the Arctic, where Shell goes running away from the Arctic, tail between its legs. Would never say that it's the environmental organisations and unions that are largely responsible for it running away. There's no gas there, there's no oil there, so we don't want to be here. The public line, whoever wants to buy that one. But I think closer to our patch, if you like, we've seen some amazing things after the 2004 tsunami in India, where women were working hard to receive the same relief supplies as men, receiving shelter, receiving water through the distributions. And then it got to the point on the issue of land. Governments trying to take land away from people in India. The story was the same in Sri Lanka, as everyone knows. And women mobilising. And then, instead of an evacuation that was planned of whole communities so corporations could come in and build hotels, the whole game changes. Men are going to receive land. Women push back. Women receive land titles for the first time in that part of India. That story gets better. Those same women who received land titles, some of them actually travelled to New Orleans after Katrina to advise African American communities facing the same threat on how to hang on to their housing and not to lose it. So this is all coming from a collaboration, which I think is a key word, as Mark has pointed out earlier today. And I think unusual collaborations between First Peoples, between women's movements, unions, environmental organisations, global justice organisations, where there's a collaboration supporting grassroots movements to defend their land, to defend their lives, to defend the earth. And that raises some questions for us as a group, I think. Are we too practical? Are we not political enough? Are we too focused on delivering services? Do we need to do more with strengthening movements that are trying to hang on to their very survival, which is inherently political when you're fighting power? And I feel we're in an extraordinarily privileged place, really, because supporting social movements is embedded in the heart of ACFID. If we look back over the 50 years, and congratulations to Patrick for the history, but looking back over that period, that is embedded in the history of what we do. So there is a fantastic opportunity in front of us to really get out there, support movements and continue to win. And just to say, I think we need to scale up our efforts and we need to leap. Thank you.
Microphone crisis. Okay. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Cassandra Goldie, who will also be very familiar to most people. I'll just fill while she... That's all right. Got it? So Cassandra Goldie, on my right, on your left, joined ACOS as its Chief Executive Officer in July of 2010. Previously, she was the Director of the Sex and Age Discrimination Unit at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Cassandra has extensive public policy experience and is a leading advocate and commentator on economic and social issues. You might have seen her on the telly occasionally. She has represented the interests of people who are disadvantaged and those of the community sector in major national debates, including through the Prime Minister's National Panel on Economic Reform in 2013 and the Ministerial Roundtable on Superannuation and the National Tax Forum. Cassandra has worked globally as a human rights advocate, including through the United Nations Commission on the... You'll let me finish my sentence, won't you? On the status of women and UN Habitat. She also has some legal experience. Cassandra Goldie. You could send in shorter bios, by the way.
Where do I came from?
Cassandra Goldie.
And also, congratulations to ACFID. It's just, it's really great to have that sense of history and also sense of hope. And I'm with Archie on this one, having been in this role for 5 years and in sort of pretty much, the rough and tumble of a pretty tough political time. I have really come to a place of, again, renewed sense of great hope about the fact that on this theme of denial, Hayden, that people do make good decisions if they've got the right information available to them. And I think that one of the most important wins for us was absolutely the way that as a community people pushed back against that nasty, divisive federal budget of 2014. And by and large, with some important exceptions, a lot of the worst of that budget was absolutely stopped in its tracks. And those were messages against privatisation. Those are messages against picking off the people who are the most vulnerable in the community. And it was a message to government to say, we know that you are picking on the people who you perceive as being the least politically powerful in society, and that as a community we don't like it. We don't like it. And that beyond that, the fact that in that very obviously highly contested, there were various views in Canberra, I'm sure, about would the previous Prime Minister go or would he stay, that in fact the message, the tone of that leader that wanted to appeal to the worst in us was widely rejected. It was really widely rejected, and without sort of assuming the politics of this room, if you've spent time with Liberal voters in any significant way, there were many people from that side of politics also who said, we will have these debates about the economic model, but we don't like that. And I think what we should absolutely claim in this room is that to a significant extent, it was civil society and community leaders who really helped to create the space and the sense that it was okay to say no, and that in fact that when people were bullied, the likes of Gillian Triggs were bullied, that overwhelmingly unusual alliances, everybody came out and said that is enough. We will not allow that to happen. And the AFR put Gillian Triggs in the top 15 most powerful people in the country, you know, to put her up there and say we should be proud of this woman for having held the line against some of the worst, both in terms of policy and also in terms of the way that we treat each other. So that's where I come from in going, right, now what's next? And I think, look, on the one hand, I'm sure, as Hayden said, well, you're one of those ones for economic growth, and it's true that I have been out there talking about inclusive growth. We have been out there saying if you're going to set a growth target, you have to at the same time set a poverty reduction target. That's the deal. That's the deal. That's the test of whether this commitment to growth is actually really going to be delivering into the future in the way that we would want it to have. But at the same time, I do think it is absolutely instinctive in us that we are searching for the alternative. That in this recognising, you know, as the knowledge comes through, and some will say the knowledge has been there for a long time, but instinctively in the community we're recognising that this is not a forever story, that we have to find the alternatives, and some of those alternatives are here right now being challenging us. So, you know, as ACOS, we talk a lot about the fact that people should be worried. They will worry. We will worry about where our economic security comes from. We will want to know that we can feed ourselves and we'll be able to look after our kids and everything. And where will the jobs come from? And instinctively, we kind of know that that's a very uncertain future. And I think what we're seeing here is there are these subtle changes happening in terms of a return to community around the way in which we will do the meeting of our needs. Now, I don't quite know where that will end up. I don't think any of us really know what that's happening. But it seems to me one of the most critical things that we can do is to help to build the new community infrastructure to enable us to be adaptive, to communicate with each other, to stay close to each other, so that we are able to have the best knowledge amongst ourselves about what's going on, to have access to the open source data that is there so that we can really say, right, I didn't know that, did you? I guess how I describe it is it's like the contemporary version of the old town hall. You know, something hit and we all got in a room together and said, right, what are we going to do now? And that's the kind of community, and that's where I think in terms of civil society organisations, because this is a room, a lot of NGOs, I think it is absolutely incumbent upon us, and I include ACOS in that, and our members, ACFID and others, to say where are we creating the space to put our own time into that sort of leadership at community level at the same time as we are by and large meeting needs in the particular current model that we have before us. And so I think that's, we might call it advocacy, we might call it, you know, remember the term community development, that one? But with the technologies that we have available to us now. So I think that's a really exciting discussion. And at its heart, of course, it's about a reinvigorating of participatory democracy. And may I congratulate the crossbenchers for doing their bit, for stopping the worst of the budget, because I think some of that reflection in terms of the way we're voting is also, frankly, a pretty healthy sign. Because unfortunately, the ALP waved through the healthy welfare card yesterday in the Senate. So it's with us. So that is a shame, to put it lightly. So again, I think in us looking to the politics of this, but also recognising that, yes, there is a story there to be said about government policy, but I really think we need to recognise that I've heard a lot of business leaders talking about innovation, and I'm not sure they really know what they're talking about yet either. So let us not assume we don't have a lot of those answers as well. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. And our last speaker on my far left, on your right, is Alice Cope. I'll do my best not to give you a long bio.
I think I said a short one.
Good, okay, great. Thank you. So Alice joined the UN Global Compact Network Australia as Executive Manager in May 2013. Before that, she was a Policy and Sustainability Advisor at the UN Global Compact in New York, where she focused on business and human rights and supply chain sustainability. She was the lead author of the UNGC's exposure draft of the Business Reference Guide to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Alice also managed government relations for the UNGC for the Rio +20 Corporate Sustainability Forum. She's consulted to the private sector on business and human rights and national and international corporate responsibility standards and frameworks. Before moving into corporate responsibility, Alice was a senior associate at law firm Allens. She has a Master of Communications, Bachelor of Laws with first class honours, Bachelor of Finance and a Bachelor of Economics. Please welcome Alice Cope.
That's not the bio I sent. I did send a short one.
There you go.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's great to be here, so thanks for the invitation. I actually feel after some of those presentations that I might actually be the heretic in the group.
Excellent.
I think I was really invited to talk about the role of business in relation to all of the issues that have been discussed at the conference. So just a little bit of background for some of you who aren't familiar with the Global Compact. It's the UN's and also the world's largest corporate responsibility and sustainability initiative. Our framework is based around principles in the areas of human rights, labour standards, environmental responsibility and anti-corruption, and also broader questions around the role of business in societal issues and in relation to UN goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which I know have been discussed today as well. So I wanted to start off just by talking about two aspects in relation to business engagement in this space. The first one of those, which really needs to be at the heart of conversations around business engagement, is the notion that business has a responsibility to act responsibly. So they need to really focus on identifying, mitigating, preventing, and accounting for negative impacts. And that is really core to engaging business in this space and managing some of these issues where we are a market-driven society. When you then look at some of the issues that we're talking about, there's also a really significant opportunity to engage business to drive positive impact. So I think in that sense, there's concepts like shared value really come into play. And there are a lot of opportunities where business can be activated to find a positive impact. But a point that I make again and again, and that sometimes gets lost in these conversations, is you can't have a business creating shared value over here. That does not offset negative impacts elsewhere. So making sure that we're keeping both of those aspects in mind when we're talking about business engagement is really crucial. And both of those aspects will actually make a really strong contribution to things like the Sustainable Development Goals. If we had businesses all around the world doing simple things like respecting human rights and paying fair wages, including through their supply chains, the impact would actually be really significant and huge. There's also a really strong business case for business to engage on these issues, and I just wanted to sort of run through some thoughts on that. First of all, just talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think they're a really helpful frame and a concrete frame to start talking about, and that's certainly something business finds useful. The SDGs are really aiming to redirect public and private investment flows towards the issues that they're looking at. And so there are actually really significant opportunities for businesses that are offering solutions to the issues that the SDGs talk about. The SDGs also really enhance the value of existing and future corporate sustainability efforts. What we're really seeing is that increasingly a lot of issues that have traditionally been externalities for companies are over time becoming internal costs for them. And there's a role for regulation and other issues that is sort of growing and that is sort of enhancing over time as well. It's also really, there's also, I think, a growing sort of convergence of and social norming really of corporate sustainability and the expectations on the private sector to contribute to issues such as those identified by the Sustainable Development Goals. PwC has recently released a survey that actually shows 90% of citizens believe that business should sign up to the SDGs. It's a really high number, and that's critical for business to understand and realise that, that there are really high expectations on them from society. It's also important for business to have operating environments in which they can really flourish, and the SDGs are certainly looking at a number of those things in terms of creating strong governance structures and stable societies. So again, there's a lot of interest, I think, from business in relation to those aspects of the Sustainable Development Agenda as well. And I think there are really a lot of opportunities to see this growing sort of common language and common narrative, and I think as imperfect as the process perhaps was in negotiating the SDGs, you're never going to get a perfect process. It was more inclusive than any such process that the UN's run before. It did involve civil society, it did involve government, and it did involve business. And I think because of that, it has greater legitimacy than perhaps some of the other processes that they have undertaken in the past. I also think that there's a really strong role for NGOs in relation to this. I think one of the things that has sort of come out of these conversations is what we really need is to find the drivers of change. I think if we want to change the market in a really pragmatic sense, we actually need to look to business as part of the solution for that. It would be great to find, if we could completely start from scratch and build a completely different model, but I think where we are and where we need to get to, and we need to get there quickly, we need to see business as an ally and find the drivers so that we are driving responsible business, so that we are driving business towards making a really positive contribution. There are challenges. I mean, I think one of the key challenges that I hear again and again from companies is it is often difficult to balance short and long-term issues. So a lot of these issues require investment and a mind shift to the long term, but certainly for listed companies, there's still a lot of pressure to have short-term results. I think leadership is really critical as well, and we are seeing, particularly in relation to the investment angle, corporate leaders are starting to push back a little bit. I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with Paul Polman, who has actually said to his investors, I'm not reporting quarterly anymore because I'm focused on longer term issues, and if you don't like it, you can get out of our, you can sell your shares. And that's amazing. I mean, that's the first time we've had someone leading a big company make such an amazing sort of statement to his investors. And I just wanted, I guess, to get back a little bit to some of the drivers and some of the solutions. I think that we already have a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the technologies that can solve some of the issues that Hayden, in particular, you were talking about. I think the knowledge exists in the world. We just need to scale it up and reorient the market, really, so that that's what's being invested in and scaled. And I think that there's a role for everyone in this room, and certainly for ACFID and for the NGOs at their own level and in relation to their own relationships as well, and in relation to all of us as individual consumers. CEOs have been surveyed and they understand intellectually that these issues should be relevant to them, but they're often not flowing through in a financial sense. When surveys are conducted of consumers, everyone says, yes, we want to buy products that are sustainable, but at the point of purchase, it is a very small group of consumers that actually change their purchasing behaviour based on the sustainable sort of qualities of a product. And that's incumbent on every single citizen, and a real opportunity, I think, to drive change. So I'm filled with hope, and I think that the drivers exist, the technologies and the knowledge exists. We just need to sort of scale it up and see business as a partner. Certainly the businesses I talk to who are part of the Global Compact, there are a lot of passionate people in business who care about these issues. And we just need to find ways that we can work together and really build the collaboration and bring the different talents and knowledges and skills of the different sectors together.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to hear after we're all going to be ruined by economic growth and we're all going to die because of the earth, that people have hope and optimism. That's a good place to start. I would like to start by asking Hayden, your thesis about economic growth. People in this room maybe have been working all their lives on development and maybe have thought that the growth is ultimately the objective in the communities that they're working in. So how should these organisations respond to the thesis that growth ultimately is bad, and presumably it's growth in the developed world that is worst? What can they do about it?
Well, of course, the SDGs are interesting in that number 8 is promote sustained. Oh, sorry, I'm meant to be having my
Microphone, that'd be great. Thank you.
Is it on?
Yep.
Yep. Sorry. SDGs are interesting that number 8 is really promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And it suggests a target of a 7% GDP growth rate for the less developed countries, which is really high.
Yeah.
You're doubling your economy in 10 years. So arguably, and later on, I forget which number it is, it's very low down there, and it talks about, but we mustn't damage nature and biodiversity, and it's sort of way down. And I would suggest that there is a fundamental unreality reconciling the two. What do we mean by sustainable economic growth, which is one of the things that I look at in my book. And as I said, I'm the co-director of the New South Wales chapter for the Centre for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy. Now, the idea of that is, which came up with Herman Daly in the 70s, and is that you can have growth, but it's not due to your population endlessly increasing, and it's not due to your resource consumption endlessly increasing. If it happens because we're cleverer, smarter, more creative, yeah, you can have growth, but on a finite planet, it's not due to those things going on, because that's why we're heading for environmental crisis that's rapidly worsening. Now, of course, that's not what the SDGs mean, though. They're not on about a steady state economy. Like UNEP's green economy, they don't even mention that, that such a thing, an idea, exists, and they don't talk about overpopulation. Overconsumption, there's some good stuff in there, and I wouldn't criticise stuff happening with supply chains, or the circular economy. I've just edited a book that's coming out next year called The Future Beyond Growth, where we talk about the circular and green economy and how they relate to other economies. But the point is, it's not addressing consumerism, the consumer culture as such. So, we tend to, as society and academia, I'm quite happy to admit, we create weasel words like absolute decoupling, where you decouple the environmental impact from growth and, how, because it hasn't happened. Sustainable growth, green growth, good growth.
Briefly, because we're...
Yeah, okay. Well, it's just that... what do we do differently in terms of being positive? Well, I think the key thing is dialogue. You've got to have dialogue. If you're going to break denial, you've got to have dialogue and talk about this. And coming back to Archie's point about collaboration, I think there is increasing popular collaboration and discussion of some of the taboo things. For instance, I organised the Fenner Conference on the Environment last year, was at UNSW. It was called Addicted to Growth, ? And I don't think 5 years earlier the Academy of Sciences would have supported such a thing. So and for instance, I'm taking a group from the Faith Ecology Network out bush on Sunday. So again, there's the faith groups that have come out with a very strong statement questioning endless growth. So bringing all those partners together to actually question things and have dialogue, I think, is the best.
Thank you.
The key thing we've got to do.
I'll come back to Archie, but just once I just want to ask Alice, how is collaboration working now between organisations in this sector and business, and how could it work better from the business perspective, given that you said, there's a positive in this for business too?
Look, I think that there are some really good examples out there of collaboration, but I don't think it's generally... I don't think it's sort of general. I don't think everyone's doing it very well. I think there are huge opportunities for growth in relation to collaboration. When I talk to NGOs, there's frustration. When I talk to business, there's frustration. But on both sides, there's also a keenness to collaborate. And in fact, one of the things that we're proposing to do next year is actually run workshops to build capacity on both sides so that these conversations can take place in a more helpful manner. I think that certainly not every idea will make sense for every business. And I think that the key is really to find opportunities where both parties can feel like they're contributing. And on the business side, it'd be great if people could think of how business can contribute beyond just financial resources, but how they can actually contribute in other ways with their expertise and their technology and that sort of thing. And find overlapping interests and where there are opportunities to create things that make sense for both of them.
Thanks. Archie, you wanted to say something about growth just briefly, then I have a question for you too.
Yeah, sure. No, just quickly, because I think we've got it the wrong way around. Because as I understand it, not being the brightest guy in the room, but economics is all around the allocation of resources amongst competing priorities. It's not about growth. And if you look at an economy that is there to serve social good and really to promote the good society, the economy is actually there really to provide full employment, because employment is integral to our sense of selves and to self-actualisation. It's there to provide affordable housing for people. It's there to provide access to essential services such as quality free education and healthcare, water. That's what the economy is there to do. When it becomes the growth conversation, all that gets flipped around, because we're looking at this numerical target, which in a sense means so what? And you may need growth to achieve an economy that's going to deliver that social good, but if you flip that around, that becomes a different conversation.
I was going to ask you, Archie, you talked about needing a new economic system. Now, people in this room might say, well, that's not my job. That's the job of government. That's the job of, global institutions, not necessarily institutions working on the ground. What do institutions or organisations in this sector have to do to their own structure and themselves or their way of thinking to address what sounds like it's a crisis in terms of our future?
Yeah. Well, if I can be a bit provocative, I think we're victims to this whole growth addiction ourselves. Everything's about how do we grow, how do we get bigger, and we fail for that. Who's the biggest NGO in the room? Who cares? It's really around.
But we're all working together.
Exactly, we are. But I think that's what I'm trying to flip. I'm trying to flip that around. I'm trying to flip it around to saying, what are we actually doing? How do we do it better together? And that needs to be resourced. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. But I think it's also the role of civil society in really determining what the next economy looks like. I mean, let's not forget that the origins, and I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a neoliberal economic model we're working off now, but the origins of neoliberalism came out of Chicago from a bunch of academics. So it came from civil society. It didn't come from some nasty guy sitting somewhere on top of a coal mine thinking, how do I screw everyone over? So I think civil society has a big role to play in firstly questioning the system, participating in how we work together, collaborating together around results, outcomes, change, and probably leaving our dollar imperative and brand at the door.
We've nearly run out of time, but if there are questions, that would be good. I'm going to toss one quick one in and then I will come to you. Cassandra, I just want to ask you, in your sector, given what Archie was just saying, do you think there's enough energy or attention given to brainstorming the ideas that are required to address these kinds of problems? Do we respect innovating and creating ideas, or do we spend enough time and resources and energy on foresight?
Look, I think there's a great desire to do it. I think to a large extent amongst particularly not-for-profit, but not only, that there is a reality of being bolted down, more and more bolted down through contracting arrangements. And Karen was just talking to me earlier saying, do you think there has been sort of change of tone from the new government and the Prime Minister? We certainly hope so. Sort of this, to say we want you to be flexible, we want you to be adaptive, and yet at the same time, I've got a member of ours ringing me saying, I'm being bolted down in my contract, like to the day. I'll deliver this today, this today, this today. And so I do think we have not been. We need to learn some good stuff around in terms of solidarity, around coming together to say that's enough on some of those fronts, and I think that's a challenge for us on this. I'll get a contract at any cost. to what extent we all start to pick up the phone at a very early stage and say, you know what, we need to get our own organising together as ourselves to say we'll be a part of this journey, but it has to be on these terms, because if you're genuine about the need we have for intuitive action and reaction in a rapidly changing environment, you have to enable us to be in a position to do that. So I think that's a really now agenda for us, and now is the time for us to really claim that one. And I'd be happy to take a few more calls. People are prepared to talk about their contract terms and tell me the detail and see what we can do.
Now, we're almost out of time, but there is a question here, and there's a microphone coming to you, I think.
Thanks everyone, great discussion. I'm Jo, I'm with International Women's Development Agency. I wanted to just return to the Sustainable Development Goals again, because I think this year it brings us an unprecedented global platform, you know, an extraordinary achievement of multilateral diplomacy that I've certainly never seen in my lifetime. If there's another example, I'd love to hear about it. My question is, for an agenda that is so beautifully balanced between people and planet and prosperity, the accountability sits with nation states, so we're all accountable to that. However, the sectors within our nation states are in no way legally bound to those accountabilities. So how do you see that we have to work differently to build those accountabilities, both calling them but also being a part of assisting the success of those goals? How do you see that we have to work differently?
Anyone?
Thanks for the question. Nation states aren't actually legally bound either, just to make that point. Look, I think I'd probably come back to drivers. I'm not sure that these are the sorts of things that you can create binding rules around for example, business. I think that there is a huge opportunity, though, to engage them in the conversation. Just anecdotally, we had a webinar with DFAT a couple of weeks ago for our businesses around the SDGs just before DFAT went off to New York. We have an event next week around the SDGs, and they've both been sellouts. Business is really interested in this agenda and really interested in engaging. I think that one of the challenges that comes up is sometimes businesses will pilot something or put their head above the parapet, and I absolutely think there is definitely a role for strong, smart advocacy in relation to getting business to do the right thing. But there have been occasions where businesses, I think, are trying to do the right thing, and they'll have a go and they'll put their hands up, or they'll make some disclosures above and beyond what's expected of them on particular issues. And I'm thinking of Unilever and their human rights report that recently came out. And instead of sort of being applauded for being the first company to pilot this amazing new framework of disclosure and reporting well beyond where they technically had to, there was a barrage of criticism about specific issues. So I think it's finding that balance so that we can actually engage people and businesses in a really positive conversation around the opportunities that these goals represent for them.
Thanks. And we are out of time. Could you please join me in thanking our panellists this afternoon?